Mortis Maledictum is a cosmic dark fantasy story, and as such may contain content not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Now, enjoy the show.
Here you are again, prepared to turn the page. You know the risk and know the danger. Let us begin. I used the book to talk to archivists across other realities. Although they couldn't help directly, they knew the beings in their worlds. They knew who would kill me on sight, who would ignore me, and, most importantly, who would help me. I needed help. It didn't always work out, but in the weeks since the archivist's death, I had contacted a few entities who agreed to help if for no other reason than that I wore the mantle. To a one, they didn't respect Quinn O'Connell, the Irish investigator from Dublin, but they all respected the Malus Bastion. It was with the help of one of those, a Libyan jinn who possessed a Buddha amulet, that I found myself streaking across the desert north of Arlit, Najar. The first thing I did with the book and with the mantle had been to make sure every being I had ever heard of knew who Anansi was and what he had done. The jinn said Anansi was starting in his metaphorical backyard where the base of his power was strongest. I think he figured a coalition of cosmic beings would try to attack him now that I revealed his identity. The eight-legged bastard probably never thought that a little mouse was coming all by himself. I touched the Buddha amulet around my neck. It was warm to the touch, warmer than the hot desert air, and it pulsed with power against my chest. The jinn said it would give me the gift of the third eye, and it would help me find the seams of the rift so I could close it. The Buddha would help, but it wouldn't do the work for me. According to the book, if I didn't have the power to stitch the rift back together, I'd need some tools. A pair of jade spikes, to be exact. The way the other archivist explained it was that I should think of the jade daggers as sewing needles. Pure jade only came from places where Anansi had opened rifts before. They were the residual power of the mortis, cut off from its source. This power eventually coalesced into the glass. Against normal workings, the daggers would be next to worthless, but using them as foci to channel the Malus Bastion's power into the rift. The first order of business I had was to return to the Jade Mine in Myanmar to get them. The next was to find a rift. That was where the jinn came in. He pointed me in the right direction, and off I went, hoping to avoid the hordes of enemies the Ebeluvic had fought. I found the point on the map I had been looking for, and turned left on the dark track. I drove straight out into the open desert, large rough-edged rocks rising on both sides of me. It obstructed the view of the road, and I burst out the other side to them, to face large dunes. Putting the jeep into low gear, I drove up the nearest dune to look at my surroundings. I saw more of the large rocky crags beyond the dunes, like a spit of land in a fiery sea. The jinn's directions had been right. I could feel the otherness slithering out of that place. Hidden amidst those rocks, I'd find the rift. The jade daggers clinked again as I moved off towards the rocks, a tiny flicker of hope burning in my chest. I felt eyes on me before I parked the jeep. Sand had gone everywhere on the drive across the dunes, and even my water had turned to brown slush. It was the mortis's power, entropy, at work. The rift felt close now, and it was guarded. The rift differed from the one in Myanmar, though. The hordes had already come through. Its purpose wasn't to let in a flood, but a steady stream. There was so much I didn't know about how it worked, or how any of this unseen world worked. A creature jumped down from a ridge on the craggy outcropping in front of me. It looked insectoid and had a glimmering black carapace with a sheen of purples and deep greens. It looked to me through 1,000 eyes and lowered its front legs as though about to spring. The jade daggers in my hands practically sung with need. Their essence called out to this creature and the entropic energy within it. It leaped forward, lunging at me straight across the ground, but as I moved the daggers up to block its attack, it leaped into the air. It was a feint, and wings sprouted from its back, kicking up the surrounding sand into a whirlwind. The grit blinded me, and I took a step back to clear myself of the gust. That gave the insect the space it needed to land and stab at me with a piercing foreleg. I swung my arm across and down in a wild swipe to block the attack I knew was coming, while I cleared my vision of the sand. I couldn't see it, but I felt the dagger connect with something solid. It offered resistance, but only just. After a minuscule delay, the dagger passed through and the insect let out a screech of buzzing anger and pain. The thing must have expected me to use weapons from my own reality, not ones from its world. I finally got the sand out of my eyes. vowing to never let that happen again should I survive this fight. The creature reared back on its hind legs and swiped all 4 of its forelegs at me this time. Its buzzing wings helped it keep its balance and flooded the space between us with the sound of a buzzsaw. It was appropriate given the churning flurry of legs forcing me back against the rock wall. It was too fast for me to land a strike against, and there were too many angles for me to defend against. One leg struck the rock a centimeter from my left temple and cracked it. If it had hit me, I would have been a corpse. As a last-ditch effort, I took my right-hand dagger by the point and whirled it through the air in a throw. It struck the underbelly of the insectoid creature, and although it didn't sink into it, an acidic hissing streamed from its wound in its midsection. It immediately recoiled and fell over onto its side, screeching, and its wings stopped their buzzing. After a moment, the creature melted into a black fog, and then into nothing. I gasped in both surprise and relief. I hate bugs.
Then you'll regret coming to this place.
I looked up to see a lynx standing on the rock directly above my head. It looked strange and out of place in this sandy world. Who are you?
You are a poor Malus Bastion.
Ignoring my question, the lynx jumped down and stepped up to me, judgment clear in its gaze.
I have no choice, yet I still don't want to help you.
It picked up my thrown dagger in its mouth and brought it back to me.
Proof that I am no agent of the Mortis.
Yeah, sure. I took the dagger, well aware of the thing's fangs and how close they were to my vitals. Where did you come from?
I don't want questions, mortal. I am allied with what was the Tusamek, and I have come a long way to see this rift closed. We must always pay our debts.
We walked along a trench between high rocky walls for a half hour, stopping often to listen. Neither of us wanted to risk a big fight in such tight quarters. If any of the other Mortis guards were anything like the Sentry, then its long reach and ability to fly would give it a serious advantage. Where did you come from? I asked when I worked up the bravery to break the silence. The Lynx gave me a glare as if I were tempting fate, but finally answered.
No one knows the machinations of the enemy. It has destroyed countless worlds. I think it knows best about how to end us. My theory is that if it brought forth a great host, the beings of power remaining in our world would retaliate. We would assuredly lose in a protracted engagement, but it would take time.
You're saying it's more efficient to open small cracks?
Yes. If you open 100 of them. The Malus Bastion cannot be in multiple places at once.
Here the Lynx paused again, sniffed the air and listening.
At least that would be how I would do it.
I felt the ground shiver beneath my feet and looked up the pathway. There wasn't anything I could spot, but the trench was too narrow and turned too suddenly to see far. The Lynx's ears perked up, and I heard the same thing a moment later. It was the sound of heavy footfalls, and there were lots of them.
Blast it, mortal, your speech has alerted them.
Me? You said 10 times as much as me. The Lynx didn't respond. Instead, it leaped atop an outcropping to see out of the trench. I clambered up after it and stood transfixed. There were at least 50 hulking beasts charging headlong down the trench's lane. They hadn't spotted this yet, but they would in a moment.
If you want to live, then climb, mortal.
I followed its advice, but it quickly became apparent that the monsters, which looked like giant gorillas with heads out of some Lovecraftian tome, would just as easily clamber up out of the trench after us. They would most likely do it faster, too. Our choices were to stay in the trench and get run over with no room to maneuver, or to climb out and get surrounded at the top of the rocks. Then, as if answering an unheard prayer, I saw the glint and electric crackling of the rift. It wasn't far. We could make it there, and with luck, we could do it before the monsters caught on. The Lynx had already come to the same conclusion and raced off, leaping from rock to rock, bounding towards the rift. I was much slower and much louder. The gorillas made it out of the trench at the same location we had climbed out at. They looked around for a moment to find us. I slid sideways to put my back to a large boulder and held my breath. For a long moment, nothing moved. I peeked around the rock's edge and saw the gang of monsters looking out in every direction. Then my luck ran out. As if of one mind, they all wheeled about and began their charge towards my hiding spot.
Run, mortal. They've spotted us.
The Lynx cried in a hiss while it sprinted at the rift, now shining black up ahead of us. It hung in midair, suspended a foot off the ground between the pillars of a great, ancient arch of polished stone. The stone shone white in the blistering sun and contrasted with the black pit of the scar in reality. I didn't have time to sit back and think about what it meant, but I would understand its significance soon enough. The beast gained on us, as the Lynx and I made our way to the rocky crags and back to where the trench opened up into a wide, flat bowl, the archway and rift in its center. The Buddha amulet around my neck felt heavy then, and its power reached out, intermingling with my mantle. I couldn't see it, per se, but as the powers conjoined, I felt the surge. The Buddha didn't understand the rift or the Mortis, but the Malus Bastion taught it, and by extension, me. I realized the Jinn's true gift. Now that I had sensed a rift, the Buddha could find more. That was what people meant when they said it was a third eye. I couldn't explain how I knew this. Maybe the mantle told me, but I just knew it. The same way I knew this rift had been open for a very long time.
Lynx, keep the monsters off me while I work,
I shouted, bounding past the feline and up to the base of the rift. It wasn't very tall, but I still wouldn't be able to reach the top of it unless it could fly, which I couldn't. It must have already decided to fight the beast, or I never would have caught up to it. I heard a tearing sound behind me as it started its attack. Glancing back only for a brief second, I saw the Lynx jumping in to hamstring the nearest monster. It bit down, and black smoky flesh fell away from the wound. Then, before the creature could retaliate, the Lynx leaped away to harry the next one, getting closer to me. It was a sound tactic, but one that wouldn't net me much time. I had to hurry. I took the daggers in my hands, and like running a needle through a rip in my clothes, I began sewing the rift shut. The noises of the fight going on behind me got closer, but I tried my best to block them out and concentrate. It wouldn't help either of us if I let myself get distracted. The jade daggers, for their part, worked just as reputed. I felt the rift pull against their motions, but inch by inch, it closed.
Hurry, mortal!
The Lynx cried. The sounds of the beast pounding on the ground trying to reach the cat harassing them were almost to the rift. I was going slower now, nearing the top, and the few final stitches were out of reach. I stuck the daggers in my belt and grabbed the ancient stone arch. Pulling myself up it, I was thankful its surface was pockmarked with age to give me the grip I needed. The top was only slightly above the rift, and I hooked my ankles together to free my hands to work. Dangling upside down, my daggers could only just reach the rift, but it was enough. The Lynx let out a feral howl of feline pain. Tearing my gaze away from the rift, I saw it laying on its side, lungs heaving. One of the gorilla-like monstrosities must have finally gotten a hold of it and threw the cat against the rocks. I redoubled my efforts to stitch the last remaining pieces of rift closed, taking careful precautions to not touch the dark smoke emanating from its mouth. There were only about 4 feet left open when the monster spotted me and slammed into the archway. The blow rocked the ancient stone and loosed my grip. For one heart-wrenching second, I seemed to float in the air, falling in slow motion, until I crossed the boundary and fell out of the world. At first I didn't see darkness anymore, and thought I had somehow made a miraculous escape, altering my fall or twisting out of the way at the last second. That was only because when there is nothing to look at but emptiness, it doesn't seem dark anymore. I could see myself, and I appeared to be floating in a void. Turning back to look where I had fallen from, I saw the other side of the rift, and it looked different from this perspective. The break seemed a tiny thing, like a speck of light or a mote of dust in all the endless nothing. I understood then the Mortis Maledictum's motivation. It was nothing and everything. It was the space between atoms, except even atoms existed. This was pure void, and the entire world I lived in was but a speck. It ground on the Mortis like a grain of sand in your eye. You dug and dug against it just to get it out. I willed myself towards that grain of sand, and as I grew closer, I could make out more. This side of the portal felt like standing inside a dark house and looking out a window into a vast array of color under a bright sun. As I approached the mouth of the rift, the light from reality showed me the darkness wasn't completely empty. Around the edges, shapes writhed in the blackness, scrambling to push back the light, to block it off, and to wall it up. The Mortis abhorred its touch and created its minions to remove it. The rifts were necessary for it to destroy our plane, but the battle was being fought on both sides. I was close to the exit now, and I could see that this battle had been going on for an eon. Bodies of black fog lay in heaps as high as castle battlements, their forms making the stonework of the Mortis' defense. There was more going on than I had thought, and I discovered the Lynx was wrong. The portal was not open for efficiency. Every second it remained, it made the Mortis spend more of its power to create the minions to defend against the heat and light of reality. It didn't act like the last rift I had seen. That one it had pushed an army through in an instant. That was an offensive engagement, while this was a siege. It all came into focus at the last instant before I moved back into my world. At the edge of the rift, I spotted it. A small strand of web floated through the nothingness, anchored by the edge of the portal. It drifted off into the black until it reached another mote of dust, another grain of sand, another reality. That was why this portal remained open, why it remained hidden, and why the Mortis permitted its existence. Webs do not form out of nothing, and Nancy must have strung it. This I knew. Moreover, spiders do not make webs floating through the air. They anchor them so they can traverse longer distances than they might otherwise reach. I had inadvertently discovered Anansi's path between realities. When I reached the edge of the rift, I gripped it with one hand, willing myself to slow. With the other, I pulled a jade dagger from my belt and resumed stitching. I didn't know how I would exit from the rift once I went back through, and this might be my only chance to close it. My body blocked a beam of light as I stood in the exit's mouth, which seemed much larger on this side. The dark minions surged up behind me like the shadow I cast was a superhighway. They wanted to stop me. I could hear their voices screaming at me inside my head. I could not turn and face them, and even if I did, what could I do? The daggers were my only defense, and I needed them to work on the rift. Instead, I shifted my position, and a beam of light cut down the line of minions, turning them instantly to ash. But just as they fell, others raced up along my shadow's new location. Despite that, I moved and stitched until finally, there was only the space for my body left. I pushed through, holding onto the edge as hard as I could. The burst of light, color, sound, smell, and life almost shattered my concentration. Somehow, I held on and pushed the dagger through the last stitch, sealing the rift. I fell from the space it had been and landed hard on the rocky ground. The air left my lungs, and I half expected a monster to come rip the life from me. But when I shut the rift, the monsters on this side simply slumped to the ground and dissolved. The Lynx had fought valiantly and had died whilst I had been inside the rift and outside reality. I never learned its name, but I buried it under the arch. I walked back to the jeep and left that place. The desert seemed so lifeless as evening came, and by the time I headed back towards civilization, it was fully dark, my headlights casting conical beams of light through the sand and dust. I had closed a rift. I had fulfilled the mantle's duty at least once. But most importantly, I had a plan to kill that fucking spider.
We don't take sponsorships or ad revenue, and we fund our show solely through the generous support of our listeners like you. Help us keep this show ad-free and, as a thank you, get access to exclusive episodes by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/Mortis Maledictum or click the link in the show notes. Thank you.